In these very hours, the world watches in stunned silence as Moscow's lifeline to Crimea crumbles. Reports from the front lines confirm it. The Kerch Strait Bridge, that vital artery pumping Russian might into the peninsula, lies in ruins after a devastating strike. Explosions rocked the structure just before dawn, sending shockwaves across the Black Sea region. Eyewitnesses describe a fireball lighting up the night sky, debris cascading into the churning waters below. Russian authorities scramble to downplay the damage, but satellite imagery doesn't lie. Sections of the bridge are severed, traffic halted, and military convoys stranded. Civilians in Crimea are already feeling the pinch. Fuel shortages spark chaos on the streets, with long lines forming at pumps that run dry faster than officials can spin the narrative. Cars abandoned, tempers flaring. This isn't just an attack, it's a severance of supply lines that's turning the peninsula into an island of desperation. Sources close to the conflict whisper of Ukrainian drones or missiles behind the blast, but Moscow points fingers elsewhere, vowing retaliation. The ripple effects are immediate: Russian troops redeploying, locals evacuating coastal towns, and a gasoline crisis gripping everyday life. As families flee northward in whatever vehicles they can fuel, the question hangs heavy: what happens when the bridge doesn't just falter, but falls for good? This is the spark that could ignite broader chaos. But hold on, because this strike isn't isolated, it's a calculated blow with layers unfolding right now. To catch every twist as this crisis escalates, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how it unravels next. Now, let's peel back the political curtain on Moscow's frantic response. Official statements from the Kremlin pour in like a scripted play, but the cracks show almost immediately. President Putin addresses the nation in a terse broadcast, condemning the strike on the Kerch Bridge as an act of terrorism by Ukrainian forces backed by Western puppets. He vows swift retribution, promising that Russian resolve will only harden, yet behind closed doors, sources reveal frantic diplomatic cables flying to allies in Beijing and Tehran for emergency support. The contradiction hits hard. Publicly, Moscow declares the bridge intact enough for essential traffic, downplaying the explosion as minor sabotage, while privately, evacuation orders for non-essential personnel in Crimea leak out, contradicting the tough talk. European leaders react with calculated restraint. Chancellor Scholz in Berlin calls for de-escalation, urging restraint to avoid a wider Black Sea flare-up, even as NATO convenes an urgent session in Brussels. Meanwhile, the White House issues a measured statement supporting Ukraine's right to self-defense, but stops short of claiming responsibility, leaving room for deniability that fuels Moscow's rage. Kiev's President Zelensky, in a defiant video from an undisclosed location, hails the operation as a strategic necessity, exposing Russia's over-reliance on the bridge for 9 years of occupation, yet he tempers it with calls for international mediation to prevent all-out escalation. The hypocrisy runs deep. Russian diplomats at the United Nations demand sanctions on Ukraine for what they term infrastructure aggression, ignoring their own history of bridge building as a symbol of annexation back in 2022. Ankara watches closely, with President Erdogan balancing ties to both sides, offering mediation while Turkish tankers reroute to avoid the volatile strait. In these hours, the political chessboard shifts, alliances strain under the weight of the blast, as promises of unity clash with the reality of severed connections. But this official posturing masks deeper maneuvers. The true power plays unfold not in speeches, but in the shadows of backroom deals. And here's where the intrigue thickens: how long can Moscow maintain this facade before internal dissent bubbles up? The contrast between bold declarations and hesitant action speaks volumes. Officially, it's business as usual; on the ground, it's a scramble for control. As governments jockey for position, the human cost mounts, with Crimean officials, those still loyal to Moscow, imposing curfews under the guise of security, while whispers of local resistance grow louder. Beijing's foreign ministry expresses concern over regional stability, hinting at economic repercussions if the crisis spills into trade routes, yet they pledge continued partnership with Russia, a lifeline that could prolong the standoff. Washington's envoy to NATO pushes for increased aid packages to Kiev, framing the bridge's fall as a turning point in the conflict's dynamics, but European skeptics like Hungary's Orbán call for dialogue, fearing energy shocks from disrupted flows. The web of contradictions tightens. Putin's inner circle reportedly debates whether to escalate with airstrikes or sue for temporary ceasefires, all while state media spins tales of unbreakable spirit. Zelensky's team, meanwhile, coordinates with allies to amplify the narrative of liberation, but privately acknowledges the risk of Russian reprisals targeting civilian hubs. This political theater isn't just rhetoric, it's a high-stakes gamble where every statement hides a move. Yet, as the dust settles on the strait, the real test comes in actions, not words. Moscow's allies rally with statements of solidarity, but commitments remain vague, testing the limits of their pact. In the halls of power, from the Kremlin to the Élysée Palace, urgency builds as leaders weigh the fallout of a Crimea cut off. The bridge's demise forces a reckoning. Can Russia project strength when its symbols crumble? Official lines blur with unspoken fears, creating a landscape where trust erodes faster than the structure itself. And now, as political winds shift, we turn to the raw force on the front lines, where the military response ignites. Russian forces surge into action the moment the blast echoes across the strait, their response a frenzy of armored columns and aerial patrols. Ground troops from the nearby garrison, some 5,000 strong, fan out along the Crimean coast, securing access points with hasty barricades and anti-drone nets that stretch for miles. Helicopters buzz overhead, their rotors slicing the tense air as they scout for threats, while missile batteries reposition to cover the severed bridge span, ready to unleash barrages at the first sign of Ukrainian incursion. The rhythm quickens, orders crackle over radios, directing convoys of 20 heavy tanks to reroute through secondary paths, but bottlenecks form almost instantly, stranding fuel tankers that carry vital supplies for the front. Explosions still smolder on the structure, sections collapsed under the weight of precision munitions, witnesses say, leaving a gaping hole some 200 meters wide that swallows vehicles whole. Moscow deploys elite Spetsnaz units to the wreckage, divers plunging into the dark waters to assess the damage, emerging with reports of twisted steel and severed cables that once powered the entire link. Ukrainian special forces claim credit in intercepted chatter, boasting of a coordinated drone swarm, over 50 units, they say, that evaded Russian air defenses in a daring nighttime raid. The tempo builds, Russian artillery pounds suspected launch sites across the Dnipro River, shells arcing through the sky in salvos of 10 or more, shaking the earth and forcing evacuations in border villages. Fighter jets streak from bases in Rostov, their afterburners roaring as they enforce a no-fly zone over the Black Sea, downing 2 reconnaissance drones in quick succession. On the peninsula, military police enforce lockdowns, herding civilians into shelters while reservists, another 3,000 called up, mobilize with rifles and sandbags to fortify Sevastopol's harbors. The chaos intensifies, supply lines snap like brittle threads, with ammunition trucks idling on detours that add hours to journeys once covered in minutes, exposing flanks to potential ambushes. Russian naval vessels, 6 frigates and a submarine wolf pack, patrol the waters, depth charges rumbling below as they hunt for underwater saboteurs, the sea churning with foam from evasive maneuvers. Kiev counters with asymmetric strikes, special ops teams slipping through minefields to target fuel depots, igniting blazes that light up the night and cripple logistics for days. The pace doesn't let up. Moscow's high command shifts assets from Donetsk, pulling back 2 battalions to plug the gap, but morale wavers as soldiers whisper of isolation, cut off from reinforcements that the bridge once funneled in waves of 10,000 monthly. Artillery duels erupt along the contact line, exchanges of fire that last hours, with Russian howitzers firing over 100 rounds to suppress Ukrainian advances probing the weakness. Drones dominate the skies now, Russian Orlan scouting positions, clashing with Ukrainian Bayraktars in dogfights that end in fiery plummets into the steppe. The human element surges, medevac choppers ferry the wounded from blast sites, carrying scores of injured engineers who toiled to salvage the span, their efforts thwarted by secondary explosions that claim another dozen lives. Commanders bark directives, accelerating deployments of electronic warfare units to jam signals across a 50-kilometer radius, but gaps persist, allowing enemy intel to flow unchecked. The military machine grinds forward, relentless. Iskander missiles stand primed on launchers, their crews counting down for preemptive volleys that could target Odessa's ports in retaliation. Ukrainian forces press the advantage, their artillery zeroing in on Russian staging areas, shells landing with precision that disrupts troop movements and scatters convoys over rugged terrain. Tension coils tighter, night falls, but operations rage on, with infrared scopes piercing the dark as patrols clash in skirmishes that leave trails of spent casings and the acrid scent of cordite. Moscow's brass debates escalation, full-scale amphibious assaults to reclaim momentum, or surgical strikes to punish the perpetrators, while the front pulses with urgency, every minute a battle against collapse. Soldiers dig in, fortifying positions with concertina wire and claymores, their numbers swelling to 15,000 in the hot zone as urgency demands it. The air crackles with radio traffic, coordinating airstrikes that hammer Ukrainian lines, vaporizing bunkers in blasts equivalent to tons of TNT. Yet vulnerabilities glare. The bridge's fall severs not just roads but command chains, forcing ad hoc relays via ferries that bob precariously under threat. As the military storm builds to a fever pitch, the true cost emerges in lives and lost ground. This isn't defense, it's a desperate scramble to hold the line. But amid the thunder of war, subscribe now to stay locked into these unfolding developments. The front lines shift by the hour, and you need to be there for every breakthrough. Now, the global stakes widen, pulling economies and alliances into the vortex. Global markets jolt awake to the bridge's collapse, sending tremors through energy sectors and trade corridors that span continents. Oil prices spike by 8% in early trading, as traders in London and New York factor in the disruption to Black Sea shipping lanes, where Russian exports once flowed uninterrupted through the strait. Crimea, now isolated, faces an immediate fuel crunch. Refineries there process some 20 million tons annually, but with the link severed, gasoline supplies dwindle to critical lows, forcing stations to ration just 5 liters per vehicle amid lines stretching for kilometers. Moscow's economy absorbs the first blow. Logistics costs for rerouting military and civilian goods via ferries balloon by 30%, straining a budget already stretched thin by ongoing sanctions that have shaved 2 percentage points off growth this year. In Beijing, officials convene emergency talks, worried that volatility in Russian gas deliveries, down 15% from last quarter, could hike their import bills by billions, prompting quiet overtures for alternative pipelines through Central Asia. Brussels demands clarity from Moscow on transit fees, as European firms face delays in grain shipments from Ukraine, valued at €4 billion annually, now bottlenecked by heightened naval patrols in the region. The ruble plunges 4% against the dollar in hours, erasing gains from recent oil rallies, while stock indices in Moscow shed 7%, with energy giants like Gazprom tumbling 12 points on fears of prolonged isolation. Geopolitically, alliances fracture under pressure. Ankaras ports overflow with diverted tankers, adding 20 days to voyages that once took half that, costing shippers millions in demurrage fees and fueling inflation in Turkish markets. Washington ramps up LNG exports to Europe, securing deals worth $6 billion to offset Russian shortfalls, but this escalates tensions with Moscow, who retaliate by hinting at export curbs on rare earths vital for tech industries. Crimea's local economy grinds to a halt. Tourism, which draws 2 million visitors yearly, evaporates as flights cancel and ferries capsize under overload, leaving hotels empty and unemployment spiking to 20% in coastal towns. International reactions cascade. In Delhi, policymakers stockpile fuels, boosting reserves by 10 million barrels to buffer against price surges that could add 2% to their inflation rate. The International Monetary Fund warns of a half-point drag on global growth if the crisis persists beyond a week, citing disrupted supply chains that ripple to automotive plants in Germany, idling assembly lines for lack of steel components routed through the Black Sea. Russian oligarchs scramble, shifting assets offshore in moves totaling $5 billion, as banks tighten credit lines fearing a liquidity crunch from frozen Crimean accounts holding $3 billion in deposits. Energy markets in the Gulf watch warily, OPEC members debating production hikes of 2 million barrels daily to stabilize prices hovering near $90 per barrel, yet Saudi Arabia leverages the chaos to lock in long-term deals with Europe at premiums of 10%. In Kiev, the economic upside glimmers. Western aid inflows accelerate to €10 billion, earmarked for reconstruction, but offset by reconstruction costs for their own infrastructure battered in retaliatory strikes. The scale chills. Worldwide shipping insurance rates climb 15% for Black Sea routes, deterring carriers and inflating food prices globally by 3% as wheat futures soar. Moscow's pivot to airlifts burns through aviation fuel at rates of 100 tons per day, draining reserves built over 18 months and exposing vulnerabilities in their $1 trillion defense spend. Partners in Tehran offer rail alternatives through the Caucasus, promising to handle 50,000 tons monthly, but political strings attach, deepening Russia's dependence on a coalition that includes sanctioned entities. The cold calculus unfolds. Investor flight from emerging markets totals $20 billion, with funds redirecting to safe havens amid fears of escalation spilling into the Mediterranean trade hubs. In Paris, Macron's administration pushes for diversified energy sources, accelerating solar investments by 5 gigawatts to wean off Russian dependencies that once accounted for 40% of imports. The economic web tightens globally. Currency swaps between Moscow and Beijing reach emergency levels of 30 billion yuan, buying time but underscoring the fragility of their pact. As the crisis bites deeper, corporations from Tokyo to Sao Paulo reassess supply chains, with electronics firms facing component delays that could shave 1% off quarterly earnings. This isn't mere disruption, it's a seismic shift reshaping alliances and fortunes on a planetary scale. Yet, behind the numbers, the human toll mounts in empty shelves and shuttered factories. Subscribe to keep pace with these economic aftershocks. They redefine power balances by the day. Now, as the dust settles, we confront the deeper implications for humanity and history. The fall of the Kerch Bridge pierces deeper than steel and concrete. It strikes at the soul of empires and the fragile hopes of ordinary lives. In these hours, as smoke lingers over the strait, Russians in Moscow and beyond grapple with a profound unease, the symbol of their reach into Crimea now a twisted relic that whispers of vulnerability after years of projected invincibility. Soldiers on the front, numbering in the tens of thousands, stare at severed supply lines and question the endless grind, their resolve fraying like the cables dangling into the sea, where once they marched with unyielding confidence. For Crimeans loyal to the occupation, the gasoline lines stretching for miles evoke a creeping dread, families huddling in homes that feel more like outposts than havens, the isolation amplifying whispers of abandonment by the motherland they were promised. This isn't just logistics unraveling, it's the erosion of belief in a narrative built over 9 grueling years, where every broadcast of triumph now rings hollow against the roar of fleeing engines. Ukrainians, from Kiev to the eastern trenches, feel a surge of vindication mixed with weary caution. Over 2 million displaced since the invasion now see this as a crack in the fortress, yet the psychological toll of retaliation weighs heavy, with civilians bracing for shadows that could descend at any moment. The world watches, hearts pounding with a collective anxiety. In European capitals, leaders confront the mirror of their own dependencies, realizing that a single bridge's demise could cascade into shortages affecting hundreds of millions, stirring fears of a winter without heat or bread. Philosophically, this moment forces a reckoning. What does it mean when a structure meant to bind a people instead becomes the fulcrum of fracture? The human psyche bends under the weight. Russian youth, raised on tales of resurgence, now scroll feeds filled with images of chaos, their patriotism tested by the reality of a war that devours not just lives but illusions of security. In the quiet pauses between alerts, soldiers and civilians alike ponder the cost, thousands of families torn apart, communities splintered like the bridge's span, leaving scars that no reconstruction can mend. This crisis exposes the fragility of power. Moscow's elite, insulated in their dachas, sense the ground shifting beneath their oligarchic thrones, where billions in assets mask a deeper hollowness of control slipping away. For the global audience, it's a stark reminder of interconnected fates, how one act in a distant sea ripples to boardrooms in New York and villages in Asia, igniting debates on resilience and the illusion of stability in an age of drones and defiance. Psychologically, the event plants seeds of doubt. Will this spark defections among the ranks, with perhaps 5,000 troops reconsidering loyalties in the fog of isolation? Or does it harden hearts, fueling a cycle of vengeance that claims another layer of humanity? The philosophical undercurrent runs deep. What is sovereignty when it crumbles under precision fire, leaving a peninsula adrift in identity? As evacuees clog roads in convoys of thousands, the emotional landscape shifts from defiance to quiet desperation, where hope flickers like the last drops of fuel in empty tanks. This isn't the end of conflict, it's a pivot into uncharted psyches, where fear and resolve collide in the minds of millions. For us watching from afar, it begs the question, how does a bridge's fall redefine not just borders, but the very essence of belonging and endurance? The tension builds inwardly now, a silent storm brewing in collective consciousness, as societies worldwide absorb the lesson that symbols, once unbreakable, can shatter trust in an instant. Yet in this abyss, glimmers of reflection emerge, perhaps a chance for dialogue amid the ruins, or merely the prelude to deeper entrenchment. Subscribe to this channel right now, so you don't miss the psychological waves as they crest and crash. These inner battles shape the world's tomorrow. And as the echoes fade, one truth lingers: everything has only just begun, with the human spirit hanging in the balance of what comes next.